The alien king stood over the ashes of his vanguard fleet, demanding the superweapon that had shattered his invincible armada. Earth's generals didn't roll out a dreadnought. They didn't unveil a planet cracker bomb. The heavy blast doors opened, and out walked a tired 40-year-old woman in a faded gray sweater. Her eyes were dead cold and entirely unafraid. The king thought it was a joke. He didn't know that in the universe, nothing is more terrifying than a human mother. The Valrayan ascendancy did not negotiate. They dictated. When their obsidian dreadnoughts blotted out the sun over Geneva, the war was effectively over. Earth's planetary defense grid had lasted exactly 42 minutes. The unified human fleets, a proud and gleaming testament to centuries of peacetime engineering, were reduced to orbital shrapnel raining down over the Pacific. Humanity was beaten. They knew it. King Oros knew it. Yet, as the alien sovereign sat in the grand requisition hall of Earth's orbital tether, his 4 crimson eyes were narrowed in quiet, smoldering fury. He was a massive creature, encased in biomechanical armor that hissed and pulsed with his every breath. His people were conquerors by genetic design. They felt no fear, no hesitation, and no remorse. To the Valrayan, the universe was a mathematical equation of power, and they were the only viable solution. Across the long steel table sat General Arthur Reed. The human looked like a man who had not slept in 3 weeks. His uniform was rumpled, the medals on his chest looking more like archaic toys than symbols of honor. Reed was sweating. The scent of human fear was acrid heavy in the climate-controlled air. Oros found it mildly distasteful. The Treaty of Saul is acceptable. Oros said, his voice a deep resonant rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. The translation collar around his thick neck rendered his alien consonants into flawless clipped English. Your worlds will pay the tithe. Your resources will flow to the ascendancy. In exchange, your species is permitted to survive. But there is one addendum. Reed swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the silence. We agreed to all your terms, Your Radiance. The heavy munitions are dismantled. The orbital platforms are powered down. I do not care about your primitive kinetic toys, Oros interrupted, leaning his massive bulk forward. The steel table groaned under his weight. I care about the New Jericho anomaly, Reed flinched. The blood drained from his face, leaving him the color of old parchment. 30 of my orbital cycles ago, Oros continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, predatory whisper. I sent my vanguard fleet to pacify your outer farming colony on New Jericho. 3 dreadnoughts, 40,000 elite shock troops. The colony had no planetary shields, no military garrison. It was a dirt rock inhabited by agrarian peasants. Oros stood up. He towered over the human general. And yet, the king hissed. My vanguard ceased to exist. Our telemetry showed a localized atmospheric ignition, a sustained directed plasma event that turned my dreadnoughts into molten slag and flash-fried 40,000 of my finest warriors in the span of 6 minutes. Your government claimed it was a geological accident. My scientists know better. It was a weapon of breathtaking, ruthless efficiency. Oros slammed a gauntleted fist onto the table. I want the architect of the New Jericho massacre. I want the engineer who designed that weapon. Hand them over and Earth breathes tomorrow. Hide them, and I will glass this continent. General Reed looked down at his trembling hands. He didn't look like a defeated soldier keeping a secret. He looked deeply, profoundly ashamed. Your Radiance, Reed whispered. There was no weapon. Do not lie to me, human. I'm not, Reed said, his voice cracking. He signaled to the armed guards by the heavy steel blast doors. We brought the architect. We brought the one who destroyed your vanguard. But you need to understand. She wasn't military. We didn't even know what she was capable of. Oros crossed his arms, his mandibles twitching with anticipation. He expected a cybernetically enhanced super soldier. A rogue AI housed in a titanium chassis. A mad genius of destruction. The heavy door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Oros stared. A woman walked into the room. She was small, even by human standards. Her dark hair was streaked with gray, tied back in a messy, careless knot. She wore faded blue jeans, scuffed boots, and a gray wool sweater that looked a decade old. There were deep bags under her brown eyes. Her hands were shoved into her pockets. She did not look at the towering alien king. She didn't marvel at the biomechanical armor or cower beneath his 4 burning red eyes. She just looked tired. General Reed, the woman said. Her voice was painfully ordinary. Nora, Reed replied, standing up. He couldn't meet her gaze. I'm sorry, we didn't have a choice. Nora Hayes looked at the general. Are the kids on the manifest? Did they make it into the Cheyenne Mountain deep bunker? Yes, Reed said quickly. Sam and Chloe are safe. 2 miles of solid granite. Best life support systems on Earth. They are untouchable. I swore it to you, Nora. She gave a single curt nod. Okay, then we're good. Only then did she turn to look at King Oros. Her expression was completely blank. It wasn't the trained stoicism of a soldier. It was the absolute hollow emptiness of someone who had already paid the ultimate price and found the rest of the universe entirely lacking in importance. You, Oros rumbled, looking down at her with unfiltered disgust. You are the butcher of New Jericho. I'm Nora, she said simply. Oros turned his massive head toward General Reed. This is a mockery. You bring me a breeding female, a domestic laborer. If this is a stall tactic, General, I will sever your orbital tether right now. She's telling the truth, Reed pleaded, stepping forward. Look at the telemetry data cross-reference the biometric logs from the colony's central servers. She was the chief agricultural technician for the terraforming array. She had full access to the atmospheric pylons. Oros looked back at the woman. She was barely as tall as his chest plate. You, Oros said, stepping closer, looming over her to cast her in his shadow. You orchestrated the plasma storm. You defeated my vanguard. Nora looked up at him. She didn't blink. You were walking toward the school. Oros frowned. What? Your troops? Nora said, her voice dropping into a flat, dead monotone. Your drop pods landed in Sector 4. They started marching north. The primary school was in Sector 5. My son had choir practice. The king of the Valraean ascendancy stared at her, trying to process the translation. I do not understand the relevance. I didn't care about your ships. I didn't care about your war, Nora said, stepping forward. For the first time, Oros felt a strange, cold prickle run down his dorsal ridges. The woman's eyes were not empty. They were black holes. But you were walking toward my son, so I took the safety limiters off the terraforming pylons and vented the fusion reactors directly into the atmosphere. You ignited the sky, Oros whispered, realization dawning on him. I burned the air you were breathing, Nora corrected. And I would have burned the rest of the planet if it meant you didn't take another step. Oros stared at the small, fragile creature. The Valraean did not understand love. They understood loyalty. They understood duty. But the sheer localized apocalyptic violence emanating from this tiny mammal was something entirely alien. Bring her to my flagship. Oros commanded, his voice suddenly very quiet. I will uncover how this creature's mind works, or I will dissect her to find out. Nora didn't fight. She didn't scream. She just put her hands back in her pockets and walked toward the alien shuttle, leaving the terrified leaders of Earth behind her. The flagship Oblivion was a monument to the Valrayans' philosophy of existence. It was dark, jagged, and aggressively utilitarian. There were no windows, only thick layers of armor, plating, and biometric sensors. The air inside smelled of ozone copper and the sharp tang of methane. Nora Hayes sat in the center of an interrogation cell. The walls were made of a pulsing dark biometal that seemed to breathe. The chair she sat in was uncomfortably cold. She had been there for 6 hours. She hadn't asked for water. She hadn't paced the room. She had simply sat there, staring at a smudge of dirt on her left boot. The heavy door retracted into the ceiling. King Oros entered, ducking his massive head to clear the frame. He was unaccompanied. He brought with him a floating holographic projector, which settled onto the smooth metal table between them. Your physiological scanners are fascinating. Oros began tapping a long, clawed finger on the table. Your heart rate has not elevated since you boarded my vessel. Your cortisol levels are baseline. By all biological metrics, you should be terrified. You are a prisoner of the most lethal empire in the galaxy. Why are you not afraid? Nora looked up. Do you have any coffee? Oros paused. The translation collar chirped lightly. A mild stimulant beverage derived from roasted beans. No, we do not consume recreational toxins. Shame, Nora said, leaning back. It's been a long day. Oros activated the projector. A 3-dimensional map of the New Jericho colony bloomed into the air between them. It was bathed in a sterile blue light. Red icons marked the landing zones of the Valran Vanguard. Green icons marked the colony's infrastructure. I have spent the last 3 cycles studying this. Oros said, his tone shifting from imperial dominance to genuine clinical curiosity. It is a masterpiece of asymmetrical warfare. The Valrayan military doctrine dictates overwhelming force. We land. We conquer. You had no defenses, but you used our momentum against us. He pointed to a cluster of massive towers on the holographic map. The terraforming pylons, designed to pump oxygen and heavy gases into the upper atmosphere to thicken the biosphere. You locked the pressure valves. You allowed the fusion core of the pylons to overheat. And then, precisely when my vanguard battalions reached the narrowest point of the valley, you vented the superheated plasma directly into the troposphere. Nora didn't look at the map. She looked at Oros's 4 eyes. It wasn't a military trap, she said, her voice weary. I told you, I was trying to block the road. Do not insult my intelligence, Oros growled. You perfectly calculated the blast radius. You funneled my troops into a kill zone. The atmospheric ignition sucked the oxygen from the lungs of my soldiers before the fire even touched them. The EMP blast from the fusion rupture disabled my dreadnoughts in orbit, pulling them down in a decaying orbit until they crashed. It was flawless. It was a panic button, Nora said flatly. I sat at a console. I watched the security feeds. I saw 7-foot-tall monsters in black armor shooting my neighbors in the street. I saw you burning the agricultural fields. And then I saw your commander point his weapon toward Sector 5, the primary school. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the cold metal table. The sheer intensity of her gaze made Oros a warlord who had conquered 14 star systems involuntarily stiffen. You don't get it, do you? Nora whispered. I didn't do the math. I didn't calculate orbital decay or EMP propagation. I just grabbed the override lever and I pulled it until it broke off in my hands. I didn't care if I blew up the whole colony. I didn't care if I died. I just needed you to burn. Oros stared at her. He studied her biological readings on his internal HUD. She wasn't lying. She was telling the absolute truth. You sacrificed your own infrastructure, Oros said, slowly trying to grasp the alien concept. You destroyed a multi-billion credit terraforming array. You killed 12,000 of your own colonists in the resulting shockwave. You crippled your planet's biosphere. Yes, for one offspring. 2, Nora corrected. My daughter was in the library. Oros shook his head. This is madness. In the Ascendancy, a defective unit is recycled. If a child falls, another is hatched. The individual is a single cell in the body of the Empire. To amputate the arm to save a single cell is a biological failure. That's why you're going to lose, Nora said. Oros laughed. It was a harsh clicking sound at the back of his throat. Lose human, look around you. I have Earth under blockade. Your leaders surrendered. You are sitting in a cell on my flagship. I hold your entire species in my hand. No, Nora said softly. You hold me. Earth gave me up because they were terrified of what you would do. But they were also terrified of me. Oros stopped laughing. Explain. When the dust settled on New Jericho, Nora said, looking down at her hands. When the rescue ships finally came, they found me sitting in the control room. The sky was literally on fire. Everything within 50 miles was glass. My neighbors were dead, but the school was untouched. She looked up, her brown eyes locking onto his. General Reed told me I was a monster. He said I committed a war crime against my own people. I told him I would do it again tomorrow. Oros felt a cold dread settle in his primary stomach. The Valraean fought for glory. They fought for resources, but they possessed a rational ceiling. There was a point where the cost of a battle outweighed the reward, and they would retreat. This creature had no ceiling. You are not a soldier, Oros said almost to himself. You are an apex predator masking as prey. I'm a mother, Nora said, and you made a very big mistake bringing me on your ship. A mistake, Oros sneered, recovering his composure. He stood to his full, imposing height. You are unarmed. You are isolated in a Class 4 containment cell. The walls are laced with neurodampeners. You cannot even scream loud enough for the guards outside to hear you. What possible threat could you pose to me? Nora didn't answer right away. She slowly stood up. She walked toward the seamless metal wall of the cell, running a hand along the cold surface. When I walked onto your shuttle, Nora said her back to him. I noticed something about your technology. It's beautiful, seamless, very efficient. Everything is connected. The environmental controls the gravity, plating the navigation. It all runs through a central nervous system. The synaptic network, Oros said proudly. A flawless fusion of biology and technology, far beyond your primitive silicon processors. Right, Nora said, turning to face him. Flawless, but centralized, which means the same system that controls the air I'm breathing right now is also connected to the plasma conduits in your engines. Oros narrowed his eyes. You cannot access the network. It requires a Valraean genetic signature. I don't need to access it, Nora said. She reached into the pocket of her gray sweater. Oros's internal threat sensors immediately flared, but she wasn't holding a weapon. She pulled out a small, crumpled photograph. It was a picture of a boy and a girl, smiling, covered in mud, standing in front of a modest colony house. Before I surrendered, Nora said, her voice dropping into a deadly quiet register. I made General Reed swear on his life that my children were put into the deep bunkers. Cheyenne Mountain, 2 miles of granite, self-sustaining. Do you know why? To protect them from my orbital strikes? Oro scoffed. No, Nora said. To protect them from what I was about to do to Earth if Reed didn't comply. Oros frowned. You were a prisoner. I was the chief agricultural technician for an entire planet Oros. Nora said, using his name for the first time. It sounded like a curse in her mouth. I know how to build a biosphere, and I know how to break one. I had biological agents preloaded into Earth's remaining water treatment facilities. If Reed didn't guarantee my kids were in that bunker, I would have poisoned the water supply of 5 continents. I would have killed billions just to make sure he kept his word. The king of the Valraean took a slow step back. He was looking at a creature that weighed less than his arm, and for the first time in his long, brutal life, he felt the icy grip of terror. You would slaughter your own species. I would burn the universe to ash and sit on the cinder if it meant my kids got to live, Nora said. She placed the photograph gently on the metal table. But Reed kept his word. My kids are safe, which means I don't have to worry about them anymore. She looked at Oros, and the hollowness in her eyes was replaced by a terrifying, burning focus. Which brings me back to your ship, Nora said. You think I'm a prisoner here? You think Earth handed me over as a peace offering? They did, Oros insisted, though his voice lacked its previous thunder. Earth didn't hand me over, Nora whispered. Earth let me off the leash. They put me on your flagship because they knew what I would do. You can do nothing, Oros barked. You have no weapons. I am the weapon, Nora said calmly. She reached up and placed a finger against her own neck, right over her carotid artery. Your biomedical scanners, the ones you used when I boarded, the ones keeping track of my heart rate. They are linked to your ship's synaptic network, aren't they? To monitor prisoners and ensure they don't carry pathogens. Oros didn't answer. He didn't need to. The slight widening of his 4 eyes told her everything she needed to know. Your doctors took a blood sample when I arrived, Nora continued. They screened it for viruses. They screened it for explosives. They didn't screen it for synthetic heavy water isotopes. Because why would they? It's just water. What have you done? Oros demanded, his armor hissing as he stepped forward. Before I got on the shuttle, I drank a liter of deuterium-laced water, mixed with a highly unstable dormant catalytic enzyme, Nora said. It's harmless, unless it's exposed to the specific ambient radiation emitted by a Valraean plasma drive. The same radiation that is currently pulsing through this ship. Oros froze. His HUD began to flash yellow. It takes exactly 8 hours for the enzyme to metabolize and saturate my bloodstream, Nora said, glancing up at the cell's chronometer. I've been here for 6 hours. In 2 hours, my biology is going to trigger a localized fusion reaction. My body will become a walking 10-megaton thermal detonator. I am going to detonate right here inside the heavily shielded core of your flagship. Oros lunged across the table, grabbing Nora by the throat. He lifted her off the ground. She didn't struggle. She just looked down at him, her face turning red as her airway was crushed, a grotesque smile playing on her lips. If you die, you will destroy the flagship, Oros roared, shaking her. You will die, Nora choked, but managed to force the words out. My kids are safe. You are dead. Oros dropped her. She collapsed to the floor, coughing violently, gasping for air. Guards, Oros bellowed. Jettison this cell, throw her into the void. The doors remained closed. The lights in the room flickered, turning from a sterile blue to a warning crimson. Nora sat up, rubbing her bruised neck. She laughed. It was a broken wheezing sound. Too late, Your Radiance. I told you, your network is centralized. When your biomedical scanners detected the anomaly in my blood 10 minutes ago, the ship's automated quarantine protocols engaged. You can't open the doors. You can't jettison the room. We're locked in here. Oro smashed his fists against the biometric lock on the door. Sparks flew, but the heavy biometal did not yield. He turned back to the small human woman. You are insane, the alien king whispered, trapped in his own cage with a monster he had invited inside. No, Nora said, leaning back against the cold wall, closing her eyes as the countdown in her blood continued to tick away. I'm a mother, and you threaten my children. King Oros did not panic. Panic was a biological defect bred out of the Valraean lineage 100 millennia ago. Instead, he calculated. He drove his armored shoulder into the biometric blast door. The impact sounded like a meteor striking bedrock. The dark biometal dented inward a fraction of an inch, then smoothly reformed, rippling like dark water. Oros struck it again, and again. The reinforced hinges groaned, but the quarantine seal held firm. The ship's neural network was designed to contain biological horrors from the deepest trenches of uncharted worlds. It was not meant to be broken from the inside. Behind him, Nora Hayes coughed. It was a dry, rattling sound. Oros turned his 4 eyes blazing in the dim, pulsing crimson light of the cell. He activated the command channel built into his cranial plating. Bridge, this is your sovereign, Oros barked. The transmission hissed with static, but the connection held. Override Sector 7 quarantine. Prime the ejection sequence for Interrogation Cell 4. Do it immediately. A voice crackled back over the internal speakers. It was Fleet Commander Xylar, his tone laced with tightly controlled confusion. Radiance, we cannot. The flagship's autonomous immune system has locked the primary subroutines. It detects a level 9 extinction-level pathogen in your quadrant. If we drop the containment field, the ship will automatically scuttle the entire deck to prevent atmospheric transmission. It is not a pathogen, Oros roared, stepping away from the door. It is a synthetic radioactive catalyst. The human is a localized explosive device. Jettison the room into the void. Silence hung on the comms for 3 long seconds. Radiance, the explosive yield. What is the projected yield? Oros looked at Nora. She was sitting on the floor now, her knees pulled up to her chest. She looked terribly small. She also looked terrifyingly calm. 10 megatons, Nora said to the room, her voice carrying easily in the sealed chamber. Give or take, depends on how much of the Valraean ambient radiation I soak up. Judging by the heat in here, I'd say I'm cooking nicely. Oros relayed the information. 10 megatons. Localized fusion reaction. By the ancestors. Xylar whispered the discipline in his voice, finally cracking. Radiance, if we jettison the cell, it will not clear the flagship's blast radius in time. A detonation of that magnitude. It will crack the ship's spine. The warp core will breach. It will vaporize us, and the resulting shock wave will wipe out the 2 dreadnoughts holding formation off our port bow. Oros stood completely still. The math was brutally simple. He was standing on a bomb that could not be defused inside a box, that could not be opened on a ship, that could not get away. Cut through the bulkhead, Oros commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous low rumble. Bring the heavy plasma cutters. Carve this cell out of the hull manually and throw it out. The biological shielding will absorb the plasma cutter's radiance. It is designed to withstand a direct hit from a solar flare. We will try, but it will take hours. You have less than 2, Oros said. He severed the connection. He turned his massive armored bulk toward Nora. She hadn't moved. She was watching him with a detached clinical interest, like a biologist observing a frantic insect trapped under a glass. You think you have won, Oros said. He walked slowly back to the steel table looming over her. You think you have outsmarted the ascendancy, but you are a fragile carbon-based mammal. I do not need the ship to stop you. I only need my hands. He reached down and grabbed her by the collar of her gray sweater, hoisting her effortlessly into the air. Nora's boots dangled a foot off the deck. She didn't struggle. She grabbed his thick, scaly wrist to steady herself, her breathing shallow but perfectly measured. If I sever your head, Oros hissed, his mandibles clicking inches from her face, your biology ceases. The enzyme stops metabolizing. The reaction is halted. Nora's lips curled into a weak, utterly devoid of humor smile. You didn't study human biology enough, Oros. You just looked at our weapons. Speak, he commanded, tightening his grip. The catalytic enzyme isn't tied to my digestion. It's tied to my circulatory system. Nora rasped, her face flushing, as the collar dug into her throat. It requires oxygen to remain stable during the gestation period. My heart is pumping that oxygen. If you snap my neck, my heart stops. The oxygen supply plummets. The enzyme destabilizes instantly. Oros froze. It's a dead man's switch, Nora whispered, staring directly into his 4 burning eyes. You kill me. I don't stop ticking. I detonate right now. You cut off my arm to bleed me out. The blood pressure drops, the enzyme destabilizes, I detonate. You knock me unconscious, my heart rate drops, the enzyme panics. Boom. The only way this countdown lasts the full 2 hours is if I sit here alive, awake, and breathing. Oros stared at her. He searched her face for the lie. He scanned her biometric readouts on his HUD. Her pulse was steady. Her cortisol was flat. She was telling the absolute, undeniable truth. Earth had not sent a saboteur. They had sent a living, breathing paradox, a weapon that could not be disarmed, killed, or ignored. Slowly, Oros lowered her to the ground. He released her sweater. Nora stumbled, slightly catching herself against the table. She coughed again, rubbing her throat. A thin sheen of sweat was beginning to form on her forehead. The enzyme was working. Her body temperature was rising. Your own people, Oros said, his voice stripped of its imperial thunder, leaving only a hollow disbelief. They built you into a suicide engine. They sent you to die. No, Nora said, leaning against the cold metal wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor again. She closed her eyes. General Reed didn't want to do it. He told me it was a violation of the Geneva Conventions, a violation of human rights. He begged me to just go into the bunker with the kids. Then why are you here? Nora opened her eyes. They were completely devoid of light. Because, she said softly, my husband was a pilot on the Lunar Defense Station. When your Vanguard blew the station into gravel, he didn't even get to send a goodbye message. He just burned. She looked at the small, crumpled photograph of her children sitting on the table. Reed told me the treaty terms. Nora continued. He said Earth would surrender. We would give you our resources. But I know how empires work, Oros. You take the titanium. You take the water. And in 10 years, when you need more soldiers, you come back and you take the children. You draft them into your vanguard. You strap armor to them and send them to die on some alien rock. Oros remained silent. That was exactly the Valraean doctrine. Integration through subjugation. I wasn't going to let my kids grow up on a farm just to be harvested by you, Nora said. So I went to the planetary defense labs. I found the synthetic isotope. I drank it myself. Reed didn't build this weapon. I did. I walked in here and I locked the door. Oros looked at the small, sweating woman. He finally understood the fundamental error his species had made. The Valraean conquered by crushing the military, dismantling the leadership, and enslaving the populace. They assumed the populace was a herd of livestock waiting for a new shepherd. They did not account for a sheep that would willingly swallow a hand grenade and walk into the wolf's den. The cell was getting hotter. The ship's environmental controls were trying to compensate, blasting frigid air through the vents, but it wasn't enough. Nora was radiating heat. The veins in her neck and wrists were beginning to turn a sickly, bruised shade of violet. The synthetic isotopes were binding to her red blood cells, preparing for the final catastrophic release of thermal energy. 1 hour and 14 minutes remained. Oros paced the length of the cell. The heavy footfalls of his boots echoed off the biometal walls. For the first time in his reign, the king of the Ascendancy felt helpless. His empire spanned 1,000 light years. He commanded armadas that could block out the stars. And yet his entire existence was currently tethered to the heartbeat of a middle-aged woman in a gray sweater. He stopped pacing and looked at her. There must be a neutralizing agent, Oros said. His tone was no longer commanding. It was a negotiation. A chemical compound that stabilizes the enzyme. Tell me what it is. My medical bays can synthesize anything in the known universe within minutes. Nora wiped the sweat from her eyes with the back of a trembling hand. There is no antidote, Oros. Once the isotopes bind to the hemoglobin, it's irreversible. It's basic chemistry. I do not accept that. Oros snapped, slamming a fist against the table. Everything has a countermeasure. Tell me what you want. You want Earth's independence done. The treaty is voided. I will order my fleet out of the Sol system immediately. Nora let out a dry, rattling laugh. It ended in a harsh cough. She spat a small glob of dark, metallic-tasting blood onto the floor. You think I trust you? She rasped. You're a conqueror. You leave today, you come back in 50 years with better shields. I'm not doing this to negotiate a ceasefire. I'm doing this to cut the head off the snake. If I die, the Ascendancy does not collapse. Oros argued, stepping closer. My generals will burn Earth to ash in retaliation. Your children will burn with it. No, they won't. Nora said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She looked up at him, her face flushed with unnatural heat. Your fleet commander, Xylar. He's listening right now, isn't he? The comms are open. Oros hesitated. The internal channel was still active. Xylar and the entire bridge crew could hear every word. General Reed isn't an idiot, Nora said, turning her gaze toward the ceiling, speaking directly to the hidden microphones. When this ship detonates, Earth's remaining deep space stealth satellites are going to broadcast a data packet to every Valraean ship in orbit. It contains the exact chemical composition of the enzyme in my blood. Oros felt his internal organs turn to ice. We synthesized thousands of gallons of it, Nora lied. She had no idea if Reed actually followed through with her bluff, but she delivered it with the absolute conviction of a zealot. It's in the water supply. It's in the air scrubbers of every surrendered military base. You want to send your troops down to Earth, go ahead. But every human you capture, every prisoner you take, every slave you put on your ships could be a bomb. It takes 8 hours to trigger. You won't know they have it until your ships start exploding from the inside out. Silence stretched across the cell. It stretched across the bridge of the flagship. Nora looked back at Oros. You don't fight a superior military by matching their guns. You fight them by making the cost of victory so horrific they can't afford to win. You take Earth and you'll spend the next 100 years terrified of every human you look at. We won't just be an occupied planet. We will be a plague of explosive paranoia that tears your empire apart from the inside. Oros stared at her. He could hear the panicked muttering of his bridge crew through his cranial receiver. The discipline of the Ascendancy was cracking. They were conquerors. They were not equipped to fight an enemy that weaponized their own subjugation. Commander Xylar, Oros said aloud, his voice steady but hollow. What is the status of the fleet? Xylar's voice crackled back, laced with a tremor that had not been there an hour ago. Radiance, the dreadnought captains are requesting orders. If the humans' claims are true, if the planetary population is seeded with this isotope, standard pacification protocols are entirely useless. Stand down the fleet, Oros commanded. Move all vessels to a high orbital holding pattern. Quarantine all ground teams that have already made contact. No human is to be brought aboard any Valraean vessel under any circumstances. Understood, Radiance. And your extraction. Oros looked at the heavy biometal door. He looked at the plasma torches sparking uselessly against the quarantine seal on the security monitors. He looked at Nora, who was currently pressing her forehead against the cool floor plates to find relief from the internal fire consuming her. Cancel the extraction, Oros said quietly. Radiance, we cannot just leave you to. You have your orders, Commander. Oros snapped a flash of his old Imperial fire returning. If the blast breaches the core, the flagship goes with me. Ensure the fleet is outside the blast radius. Protect the Ascendancy. He cut the comms. The cell plunged back into an eerie, pulsing silence, broken only by the ragged, wet sound of Nora's breathing. Oros walked to the far corner of the cell and sat down heavily on a reinforced storage crate. The biomechanical armor that had always felt like an extension of his own unstoppable strength suddenly felt like a tomb. He was King Oros Sovereign of the Valraean Ascendancy, breaker of a dozen worlds. And he was going to die in a metal box with a dirt farmer from Sector 5. 41 minutes remained. Nora's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The skin around her eyes was bruised, the capillaries bursting under the strain of the mutating blood cells. She had stripped off the gray wool sweater. She wore only a simple white undershirt, now soaked with sweat. Her skin was physically hot to the touch. The ambient temperature in the cell had risen by 12 degrees. She was curled on her side on the floor, shivering despite the heat. The pain had to be agonizing, a deep molecular tearing, as her body was forcibly converted into a catalyst for nuclear fire. But she hadn't screamed. She just kept her eyes locked on the photograph of her children sitting on the table. Oros watched her. He had seen millions die. He had ordered orbital bombardments that wiped continents clean. He had watched enemy generals fall on their own swords rather than surrender. But he had never seen anything like this. He stood up and walked over to her. He knelt, his massive frame dwarfing her small, trembling body. "Does it hurt?" he asked. The question was unprompted, devoid of tactical value. It was merely the curiosity of a dying man trying to understand the creature taking him to the grave. Nora blinked slowly. Her eyes were glazed, struggling to focus on his alien face. "Like swallowing hot coals," she breathed. Her voice was barely a whisper. "And chasing it with battery acid," You could have stayed in the bunker, Oros said quietly. You could have lived. I would have lived in a cage, Nora said, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. My kids would have lived in the dark. I didn't have another choice. There is always a choice, Oros replied. Survival is the fundamental directive of all living things. To override that, it defies the logic of the universe. Nora managed a weak, scoffing sound. Logic? You think a mother's love is logical? It's not. It's violent. It's ruthless. She took a jagged breath, her chest heaving. You built a culture based on power. You think the strongest survive, but you're wrong. Enlighten me then, Oros said, folding his massive gauntleted hands. As we wait for the end, the ones who survive aren't the strongest. Nora whispered her brown eyes, finding a momentary piercing clarity. They're the ones who have something to lose. You fight for an empire. You fight for a throne. If you lose, it's just a blow to your pride. She reached out her trembling, sweat-slicked fingers, lightly touching the edge of the photograph on the table. If I lose, my kids die. So, I don't lose. I don't care what the math says. I don't care what the odds are. I will break the universe in half before I let you touch them. Oros looked at the photograph. 2 human offspring. Small, fragile, totally defenseless. In the ascendancy, children were raised in communal creches trained from hatching to hold a rifle, taught to revere the state above all else. They did not have mothers. They had commanders. There was no personal bond, no fierce, irrational devotion. They were just gears in the great machine. For the first time, Oros realized the fatal flaw in the Valrain war machine. A gear can be replaced. A gear does not fight back when it is crushed. But a human mother was not a gear. She was a localized singularity of pure, unadulterated willpower. 20 minutes remained. Nora's breathing became shallow and erratic. The violet veins on her arms were now pulsating, glowing faintly with the buildup of internal radiation. The synthetic isotope was reaching critical mass. Oros! Nora gasped, her eyes squeezing shut in agony. I am here, the alien king said, surprised by the gentle cadence of his own voice. Tell Reed, she choked out, her body curling tighter into a fetal position. Tell him to keep his promise. He swore on his life. He will keep it, Oros said, though he knew she could barely hear him over the roaring in her own ears. Oros stood up. He walked to the control console on the far wall. The quarantine lockdown was absolute, but the internal communications array was still functional. He activated the command channel. Commander Xylar, Oros said. His voice was steady, resonant, and entirely stripped of fear. Radiance. We are still attempting to bypass the secondary relays, but the shielding— Cease your efforts, Commander, Oros interrupted. The timeline has accelerated. The detonation is imminent. I am transmitting my final orders. There was a heavy silence on the line. Then a quiet, We receive you, Sovereign. The Sol system is to be designated a Class Omega exclusion zone. Oros commanded. The words felt heavy in his mouth, a bitter admission of total defeat. No Valrian vessel is to enter this sector. The treaty is void. Earth is to be left entirely alone. Do you understand? Radiance, standard protocol, dictates retaliation for the assassination of a sovereign. There will be no retaliation. Oros roared, slamming his fist into the bulkhead. Listen to me, Xylar. If you strike Earth, they will not surrender. They will infect themselves. They will turn every transport ship, every colony, every captured city into a bomb. They will burn the ascendancy to the ground just to spite us. You will pull the fleet back to the core worlds, and you will erase this planet from our navigation charts." "Yes, Radiance, it shall be done." "Good," Oros said softly. "Long live the Ascendancy." He cut the connection. He turned back to the center of the room. Nora Hayes was glowing. A faint, terrible blue light was radiating from beneath her skin, illuminating the dark cell. The air was so hot, it scorched the inside of Oros's lungs with every breath. The metal floor plates were beginning to warp. Oros walked slowly back to the chair and sat down. He didn't look at the door. He didn't look at the reinforced walls. He looked at the photograph of the two human children. He was King Oros, ruler of the stars. And he had been bested not by a superweapon, not by an army, but by the terrifying infinite depths of human love. He closed his 4 eyes, folded his hands in his lap, and waited for the fire. 10 minutes. The heat inside the quarantine cell was no longer just a physical sensation. It was a suffocating physical weight. The air shimmered thick with a violent synthetic energy that smelled of burning copper and ionized ozone. The smooth, dark biometal of the walls had begun to blister. Small, jagged fractures appeared in the pulsing armor plates, weeping a strange, viscous fluid as the ship's biological immune system tried and failed to heal the microscopic tears caused by the localized radiation. Nora Hayes lay on the warped floor plates. She was no longer shivering. She was entirely still, save for the shallow, ragged rise and fall of her chest. Her skin was translucent, illuminated from within by a terrifying shifting blue luminescence. The synthetic isotopes had saturated her bone marrow. They had hijacked every red blood cell, turning her vascular system into a network of microscopic fusion reactors held back from critical mass only by the frail, fading rhythm of her human heart. King Oros sat in his chair. The biomechanical armor that encased his massive frame, designed to withstand the crushing depths of ocean trenches and the searing heat of atmospheric re-entry, was failing. The internal cooling units whined a high-pitched scream of dying machinery. The external plating was glowing, a dull, angry cherry red. He did not look at the melting door. He did not look at the failing biometric scanners. He looked at the woman. "What do you see?" Oros asked. His voice was a heavy, gravelly rumble, stripped of all its imperial arrogance. It was the voice of a soldier at the end of the long road. Nora didn't move her head. Her eyes were fixed on the ceiling, though Oros knew she wasn't seeing the blistering metal. "Rain," Nora whispered. Her voice was just a rasp of dry air over vocal cords that were already cooking from the inside. "It was raining. The day we moved to the colony, the kids hated it. Mud everywhere. Sam lost his left boot in the driveway. Chloe cried for 2 hours because the Wi-Fi was down." A faint ghostly smile touched the corner of her lips. Her teeth were stained black. "I made pancakes," she breathed. "Burned the first batch. The smoke alarm wouldn't turn off. It was a good day." Oros listened. He tried to comprehend the tactical value of the memory. There was none. She was not reciting a warrior's creed. She was not envisioning the destruction of her enemies or the glory of her ancestors. She was thinking about burned sustenance and ruined footwear. She was a creature of mundane, utterly trivial attachments, and yet she had broken the galaxy's greatest empire. "You are a paradox," Oros said quietly. "You are the softest thing I have ever encountered, and the most dangerous." Nora's breathing hitched. A sharp, wet gasp echoed in the small room. The blue light radiating from her veins suddenly flared, blinding and absolute. The chronometer above the door clicked down. 4 minutes. My heart Nora choked out, her back arching slightly as a spasm of agony ripped through her. It's skipping. The enzyme. It's tearing the muscle. Let it go, Oros said. He leaned forward, resting his heavy gauntleted hands on his knees. The war is over, Nora Hayes. You won. On the bridge of the Oblivion fleet, Commander Xylar stood frozen before the primary tactical display. The entire command deck was dead silent. The only sound was the frantic, rhythmic chirping of the ship's internal hazard alarms. The holographic schematic of the flagship hovered in the center of the room. Sector 7 was glowing white. Commander, the navigation officer whispered, his mandibles twitching with suppressed terror. The dreadnoughts have reached safe distance. The fleet is in high orbit. We are the only vessel in the kill zone. Maintain position, Xylar said, his voice entirely hollow. He looked at the biometric readouts of Interrogation Cell 4. The human's heart rate was dropping. 90 beats per minute, 70, 40. Commander, the biometal in Sector 7 is completely liquefying. Radiation shielding is at 12%, 10%. Xylar closed his eyes. He thought of King Oros. He thought of the unbreakable doctrine of the Ascendancy. Conquer, consume, expand. It all felt like a child's game now. They had crossed the dark void of space, conquered 1,000 worlds, only to find a species that would turn their own blood into nuclear fire just to protect their young. May the ancestors forgive us, Xylar whispered. In the cell, Nora's eyes fluttered shut. The pain was gone. The heat was gone. There was only a profound heavy weightlessness. She felt the muddy driveway beneath her feet. She smelled the rain. She heard the chaotic, beautiful sound of Sam and Chloe laughing in the kitchen. Her heart gave one final weak thud against her ribs and stopped. The synthetic enzyme, no longer stabilized by the flow of oxygenated blood, fractured. The atomic bonds shattered in a cascade of localized runaway fusion. King Oros didn't even have time to blink. The explosion did not start with fire. It started with silence. A sphere of absolute blinding white light expanded outward from Nora's chest at a fraction of the speed of light. It vaporized the biometal floor. It vaporized the heavy steel table. It hit King Oros, and the sovereign of the Valraean Ascendancy ceased to exist on a molecular level before his neural network could even register the sensation of heat. The blast wave tore through the flagship. The heavy armor plating of the Oblivion, designed to shrug off orbital railgun strikes, was entirely meaningless. The nuclear fire gutted the ship from the inside out, igniting the plasma drives and breaching the warp core in a chain reaction of catastrophic violence. From the surface of Earth, it looked like a second sun had briefly ignited in the morning sky. A silent, brilliant flash of blue-white light swallowed the dark silhouette of the alien flagship. For 3 seconds, the shadows in the streets of Geneva, New York, and Tokyo stretched long and sharp. And then the light faded, leaving nothing behind but a rapidly expanding ring of glowing, superheated dust drifting in the cold vacuum of orbit. The Oblivion was gone. King Oros was gone. Nora Hayes was gone. 3 miles beneath the granite peaks of Cheyenne Mountain, the Strategic Command Center was a tomb of silence. 50 of Earth's highest-ranking military officers, intelligence directors, and government officials stood perfectly still. The massive digital map dominating the front wall of the bunker was flashing a single indisputable data point. Target unknown vessel, Oblivion. Status terminated. General Arthur Reed stood at the primary console, his hands gripping the metal edge so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He stared at the telemetry data cascading down his personal monitor. Radiation signatures confirm a localized fusion event. A young radar technician said, her voice shaking. She looked up at Reed, her eyes wide with disbelief. Yield was approximately 9.4 megatons. Sir, the flagship is completely vaporized. And the rest of the fleet? Reed asked. His voice was a harsh, scraping sound. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. He felt like a ghost haunting his own body. They're breaking formation, the radar technician stammered, frantically tapping her keyboard. Energy spikes across the board. They're spooling up their hyperdrives. Sir, they aren't repositioning. They're plotting jump vectors out of the Sol system. They're running. A murmur rippled through the room. It wasn't a cheer. It wasn't the triumphant roar of a victorious command center. It was the collective stunned exhale of people who had already accepted their own executions, only to watch the firing squad drop their rifles and flee. The Secretary of Defense, a heavy-set man whose tailored suit looked ridiculous in the harsh fluorescent light of the bunker, stepped up beside Reed. "I don't understand," the secretary muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "The treaty was signed. They had us. We gave them the New Jericho woman to appease them. Why would they run?" Reed turned his head slowly to look at the politician. The sheer contempt in the general's eyes made the secretary take a physical step backward. "We didn't give her to them to appease them, Frank," Reed said, softly. "Earth didn't have a superweapon. We had a grieving mother who hijacked a defense laboratory and built a dead man's switch in her own veins. She told me what she was going to do. She told me to put her on that ship." The secretary blanched. You sanctioned a suicide bomber. You sent a civilian to assassinate a foreign head of state. Are you insane, Reed? If the rest of that fleet decides to retaliate, they will turn this planet to glass. Look at the board, Frank." Reed suddenly roared, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent room. He pointed a trembling finger at the massive screen. "They aren't retaliating. They are running because she didn't just kill their king. She broke their doctrine." Reed turned back to the screen, his chest heaving. The red icons of the Valrayan dreadnoughts were winking out one by one as they jumped into hyperspace, fleeing the system, as if Earth itself was a diseased, cursed rock. "They conquered 1,000 worlds with math," Reed whispered, leaning heavily against the console. "They calculated troop numbers, shield capacities, resource outputs. Nora Hayes gave them a variable they couldn't calculate. A human being who will willingly detonate a 10-megaton bomb inside her own chest just to keep you away from her kids. You can't fight that. You can't occupy a planet of people who might do that." Reed pushed himself away from the console. He unbuttoned the collar of his uniform. The brass stars on his shoulders felt incredibly heavy, a symbol of military authority that had been rendered entirely obsolete by a woman in a faded sweater. "Sir," the radar technician asked quietly, "where are you going? We need to coordinate the global broadcast. We need to tell the public the war is over." "You tell them," Reed said, walking toward the heavy steel blast doors at the rear of the command center. "I have a promise to keep." He took the elevator down to sub-level 4, the civilian holding area. The corridors were cold, lined with industrial pipes and harsh LED strip lights. The air smelled of recycled oxygen and fear. Reed walked past rows of temporary cots, past terrified families huddled together, waiting for the orbital bombardment that was never going to come. He stopped in front of Sector G. Sitting on a thin mattress in the corner were 2 teenagers. Sam was 15, his dark hair a messy mop, his arms wrapped protectively around his younger sister Chloe, who had her face buried in his shoulder. They looked small. They looked exactly like the kids from the photograph. Reed stood in the doorway for a long time. He had sent thousands of soldiers to die. He had written countless letters to grieving widows and parents. It was the burden of command. He knew how to do it. He knew the words: heroism, sacrifice, the greater good. But as he looked at Nora Hayes's children, the words turned to ash in his mouth. Sam looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed defensive. He saw the general's uniform, and his jaw tightened. "Where is she?" Sam asked. His voice cracked, betraying the terrified boy beneath the brave facade. "She said she had to go talk to the military. She said she'd be right back." Reed walked into the room. He didn't stand at attention. He didn't offer a crisp salute. He just collapsed onto the metal folding chair opposite their cot, suddenly looking every bit of his 60 years. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic Ziploc bag. Inside was a battered silver wristwatch with a cracked leather strap. Nora had left it with him before she boarded the shuttle, claiming it was too tight on her wrist. Reed held it out. Sam stared at it, the blood draining from his face. "Your mother." Reed started, his voice thick with a profound, crushing sorrow. He stopped. He swallowed hard, forcing the military detachment away, forcing himself to be human. "Your mother saved us. All of us. She did something. Something no army on earth could do." Chloe looked up, her tear-streaked face pale. "Is she coming back?" Reed looked at the young girl. He thought of the brilliant, silent flash of light in the morning sky. He thought of King Oros, trapped in a box with a force of nature he couldn't comprehend. "No, sweetheart," Reed said softly, a tear finally slipping down his weathered cheek. "She's not coming back, but she made sure the monsters are never, ever coming back either." Sam took the watch. He clutched it to his chest and buried his face in his sister's hair, and the sound of his weeping echoed down the cold concrete halls of the bunker. 10 years later, the sky over Geneva was a brilliant, uninterrupted blue. The orbital tether, once a sprawling hub of human commerce before the Valran invasion, had been completely rebuilt. It was heavier now, bristling with kinetic defense cannons and planetary shields. Earth had not rested on its laurels. The military-industrial complex had kicked into overdrive, reverse engineering the wreckage of the Valrain Vanguard fleet that had crashed on New Jericho. Humanity was armed to the teeth, but they never had to fire a single shot. Deep in the heart of the galaxy, the Valran ascendancy was tearing itself apart. The retreat from the Sol system had shattered the myth of their invincibility. But it wasn't the loss of the flagship that broke the Empire. It was Commander Xylar's final transmission detailing exactly how King Oros had died. The concept of the human plague spread like a contagion through the Valrain ranks. A biological fear took root. The ascendancy was built on the subjugation of slave species, integrating them into their vast logistical machine. But suddenly, every Valrain commander looked at their planetary garrisons and wondered, which one of them drank the poison? Which one of them is a bomb? Paranoia destroyed their logistics. Rebellions sparked on a dozen oppressed worlds when the slave populations realized their masters were suddenly terrified of close-quarters contact. The ascendancy pulled its fleets back to the core worlds, locking down their borders, hiding in the dark forever, jumping at shadows. Earth was designated a cursed realm, a quarantined nightmare that no alien vessel dared approach within 10 light years. Humanity had bought its freedom with a ghost. In the center of the newly rebuilt city of New Jericho, there was a park. It was lush and green, the soil rich and fertile, completely recovered from the localized atmospheric ignition that had saved the colony a decade prior. At the center of the park stood a memorial. It was not a towering spire of polished marble. It was not a grand statue of a soldier holding a rifle or a general pointing toward the stars. It was a simple, life-sized casting in dark, weathered bronze. It depicted a woman. She was small. She was wearing a baggy sweater, her hands shoved casually into her pockets. Her hair was tied back in a messy knot. She was looking up at the sky, not with defiance, not with fury, but with a quiet, exhausted contentment. At the base of the statue, there was no list of military honors. There was only a simple plaque bolted into the rough stone. Nora Hayes. She drew a line in the dirt. She dared the universe to cross it. A young man stood in front of the statue. Sam was 25 now. He wore the dark blue uniform of the Earth Defense Coalition Engineering Corps. He was tall, his shoulders broad, the awkwardness of his teenage years replaced by a quiet, grounded strength. He held a paper cup of coffee in one hand. In the other, he held the hands of a little girl, barely 4 years old. She had messy brown hair and bright, curious eyes. "Who is that, Daddy?" the little girl asked, pointing a chubby finger at the bronze statue. Sam looked up at the bronze face of his mother. He remembered the smell of burnt pancakes. He remembered the heavy, muddy boots. He remembered the way she used to hum off-key when she was working in the garden. He touched his chest, right over his heart, feeling the steady, rhythmic ticking of the silver wristwatch tucked into his breast pocket. "That's your grandmother, Maya," Sam said, his voice thick with a mixture of pride and a grief that time could dull but never fully erase. "Was she a soldier?" Maya asked, looking at Sam's uniform, trying to make the connection. Sam smiled. It was a sad, beautiful smile. He crouched down so he was eye level with his daughter, squeezing her hand gently. "No, sweetie," Sam said, looking back up at the statue of the woman who had brought an interstellar empire to its knees without ever firing a gun. The soldiers were the ones who surrendered. She was just a mom. Sam stood up, taking his daughter's hand again. They turned and walked down the paved path, disappearing into the vibrant, bustling crowd of a city that was alive, breathing, and free. High above them, the deep space listening posts tracked the silent, empty void of the cosmos. The radars were clear. The galaxy was quiet. The monsters knew better than to come back. Earth belonged to humanity, and the universe had learned a very simple, brutal truth. You can conquer a planet, you can burn a fleet, and you can break an army. But you never, ever threaten a human mother. If Nora's ultimate sacrifice left you speechless, hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. The Valran Ascendancy thought humanity's greatest weapon was made of steel and plasma. They learned the hard way that absolutely nothing in the cold universe is more terrifying or more destructive than a mother protecting her children. What did you think of Nora's ruthless final stand? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell for more gritty HFY sci-fi stories where humanity rewrites the rules. See you next time.